In May of 2024, I graduated from Marquette School of Dentistry, but the thing is, I'm just a regular guy. I wasn't top of my class in college, I'm not a raging extrovert, and you've seen the other videos on my channel, I love playing video games. This video serves as a glimpse into the inner workings of getting a doctorate degree from the perspective of an average Joe. And I hope you come away with the realization that if someone like me can become a doctor, so can you. Yes, dentists are doctors. That's what the D stands for in DDS. Both of them. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you that I am a dentist, not an artist, so be nice. Before anyone has a chance to get a degree in doctor surgery, we have to get into a dental school first. Most dental schools accept a GPA average of 3.5, which is about a B+ or A- average. My GPA was 3.85. Wee woo, fake news, this guy said he was an average Joe, but he has an above average GPA. Yeah, I know. Put down the pitchforks and let me teach you a little something about how to do well in college. First off, go to class and make damn well sure you get a 100% score on all homework and open note assignments. I had a class where I got a 64% in the final, but I had enough fluff from the rest of the class to make my average an A-. You don't have to be a turbo genius to do well in college. Also, don't be ashamed to get tutoring. Shelve your ego and go get help if you need it. I'm looking at you, Mark from Arkansas. So yes, I did do well in college, but honestly, I'll just attribute all that to my tutoring. Like 1 hour spent just studying on my own was nothing compared to 1 hour with a tutor. So please don't be afraid to go get a tutor if you need one. And also try to do well in your throwaway elective classes. Getting an A in marriage skills really helps to pad out your GPA. So yeah, undergrad was a great time. Most days I'd be done at 4 p.m. Then I'd play Smash Bros with my roommates till about midnight. Now with a shiny bachelor's degree under your belt, it's time for the dental admissions test, which tests your skills in perceptual ability, math, reading, biology, general chemistry, and organic chemistry, which are all classes you should have taken in undergrad. If you think for 1 second that I studied for this on my own, you are absolutely mental. I used DAT Bootcamp, which is a program whose job is only to get you ready for the test. I spent about 4 to 5 months for about 3 to 5 hours a day watching their videos at 2 times speed and eating potato chips on my couch. My favorite part about bootcamp is that they prepare you for the test as if you've never learned anything in undergrad. Because I don't know about you, but as soon as I took a final exam, it was gone. Everything I learned, gone like the wind. The DAT is scored from 1 to 30, with 19 or 20 being about an average score. I got a 21. My school, Marquette University, takes an average DAT score of about 20 and a GPA of 3.64, which again puts me above the bar in terms of academic work. A quick little tidbit about the DAT. Having been through dental school, I can say with 100% certainty that the DAT was the hardest test I've ever taken. Even harder than the boards exam I took to get my dental license. So on the bright side, if you get walled by this test, at least you haven't spent a penny on dental school yet. After you apply to a school, they'll invite you for interviews, which in my opinion is the most important part of your application. If you get to this point, you're smart enough for dental school. Now they're just choosing people who got a little bit more spunk and charm. At the end of the day, the DAT scores and GPAs that they accept are an average, so I saw people who had lower DAT scores and lower GPAs who were in the same room as me, so I know for a fact you don't have to be as academically good as I was to get into dental school. So if you're going into healthcare, you gotta love people. Blood, flesh, cringe, and all. I worked in customer service before dental school, so for me it wasn't hard to convince them that I like to help people. The interviews themselves were pretty relaxed, and they asked me a bunch of classic job interview questions, so it wouldn't hurt to practice a few of those questions ahead of time. I also think it's important to appear relaxed and talk organically. Ultimately, they're looking for future doctors. They want people who are personable and able to manage themselves in stressful situations, like an interview. I never really thought about it until I was writing the script for this video, but you really have to be the kind of person who doesn't freak out in stressful situations to be a dentist. I think the best way you can prepare for that feeling is just to practice being in very uncomfortable situations. Just absolutely roll around in that grime and filth. No interview or dental procedure will be as bad as having to deal with an extreme couponer at a grocery store trying to buy 30 gallons of shampoo with a mountain of expired coupons with a line of customers waiting behind them. But I digress. After the interview, I waited a few months for my acceptance letter with an invitation to start in the fall of 2020. I remember before I started, I couldn't help but wonder, was it a fluke? I always perceived that doctors were incredibly wise and abundantly smart, which they are, but does a slightly above average report card, being a battle-hardened cashier, and having a love for people a doctor make? Had I pulled the wool over their eyes? Did I slip between the cracks? All these thoughts swirled around in my head while I began meeting my other 107 classmates. To my surprise, they were all down to earth and quirky in their own way, just like me. One of them sat in the front row of lectures and watched tennis on his computer. Another hinted that he had started a new Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Another was super excited for the next season of Jujutsu Kaisen. Another played RuneScape in the back row during lectures. Everyone felt so human and I felt like I belonged. But I didn't know how we were going to be transformed into the toughest steel professionals, or even how many of us would make it that far. I'm going to break down each year of dental school one by one, starting with our first year. In dental school, there are 3 main locations where learning takes place. There was the classroom, where traditional lectures would happen, the simulation lab, where we worked on mannequins, and the actual clinic, where we interacted with real patients. In my first year, the majority of our time was spent in the classroom. Looking at this schedule breakdown, classes worked pretty similarly to how they did in undergrad. You often had a class for 1 hour a few times a week. As far as the classes themselves, they are dense, and you learn everything related to healthcare. Between all these classes, you went over nearly every organ system in the body, whether related to dentistry or not. Everything we learned was relatively familiar, since you already had to know all this stuff for the DAT and for your undergrad degree. But now we were going through it way faster and in way more detail. Remember when I said that a good strategy for good grades was to nail the homework so you could afford to do worse on tests? Well, good news, there's almost no homework. Bad news, there's almost no homework. Nearly all your scores are based on quizzes and tests, and as a new rule for dental school, you're required to pass every test. If you get a 60 and then a 90% on your tests, they don't average out to a passing score. On top of that, the minimum passing score is 75, so yeah, stakes have gotten a lot higher. The other place that occupied most of our time was the simulation lab, which I'll call Sim Lab from now on. Sim Lab is like lecture and hands-on training combined. It went something like this. Good morning, class. Make sure you have out your ivory block, high-speed handpiece, and burr blocks. This is a high-speed handpiece. You put in a burr and it makes the burr spin really, really fast. Go ahead and use your handpiece to dig your burrs into the ivory block a bunch of times. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but that was literally day 1 of dental school. I don't really know what I expected. Like this was me showing up to a construction site with a jackhammer and my boss goes, yeah, the jackhammer goes up and down. Cool, right? Well, now go break that rock over there. In other classes, we started by doing similar exercises like using wax to make shapes. Eventually, things ramped up into more advanced techniques. Although it was all fun games until competencies showed up. Competencies are no joke. Essentially, you'd be given a tooth to cut, and then they would score you based on a laundry list of requirements. The tooth had to be cut to a very specific dimension, where 1 millimeter is the difference between passing and failing. Imagine working upside down, using a mirror, holding a drill that spins 200,000 RPM on a tooth the size of a fingernail. And if you cut something just a tiny bit wrong, you fail. So how did I do? Fine. And so did all my other classmates, because you were forced to practice over and over and over again. Competencies weren't a surprise. We knew what tooth and what surfaces long before any competencies, and they were all ones we'd practiced during class. So even though it was stressful, it was very doable if you can get over the nerves of performing under pressure, which I said earlier was something you should probably already be good at. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. The last segment that took up our time was the clinic. In the first year, we hardly knew how to do anything, so we would spend a few afternoons assisting in the main clinics where the upperclassmen were seeing patients. The goal was to get us exposed to seeing live patients and being in the clinic. I'll be 100% honest, I never paid attention while assisting the upperclassmen. I would hold the suction like they asked, but I only allocated enough brain power to do it correctly. With tests and competencies on my mind, I just wasn't ready to understand what the real clinic was like yet. And while I don't recommend shutting off your brain like I did, I understand why I did it. Aside from assisting upperclassmen, we started to learn how to take x-rays. And within the first weeks of school, we were taking x-rays on real patients. I had my first patient interaction doing this. I was so nervous that I was literally dripping sweat on the inside of my face shield. It was embarrassing, but it was really important to help ease us into treating patients for real. So how a normal day would go during my first year, I had classes at 8 a.m., so I get up at about 7 a.m., then I had classes until 4 p.m. Most nights I didn't study unless the test was coming up, so if there was one, I would spend a couple hours studying. Aside from that, the rest of the evening was mine to enjoy. I always go to bed at midnight, so I had 6 or 7 hours to relax, then I was up again at 7 a.m., which was a solid 7 hours of sleep. I don't know about anybody else, but that was a pretty manageable schedule. So how would I rate D1 year? I would rate it a 7 out of 10 for overall enjoyment and a low stress score of 3 out of 10. At this point, there isn't really much expected of you, so it feels like a glorified year of undergrad. Alright, second year, D2. This year you'll spend the majority of your time in the sim lab. A little bit less in class, and you get a little bit more time in clinic. Let's talk about the sim lab first. Have you ever seen one of these things? These little bastards suck. They suck to make, they suck to wear. These are dentures. If you don't have teeth, chances are you gotta wear a denture. And year 2 is the year where you learn how to make them. You would spend half of your day learning about the principles of dentures in the classroom, then you would put that information into motion by making a denture in the sim lab. The hardest part about this process is how as a student, you don't know the purpose of a step because you don't know what's coming next. Like, they can tell you, but you have no idea of what it meant until you got to it. It's like putting together a piece of IKEA furniture where you don't really know why you're screwing these 2 wooden slabs together, but as you keep going, you end up with a nightstand. It's an extremely steep steep learning curve, and lots of my classmates agreed that these classes were the hardest we came across. Along with the other classes in the sim lab, there was notably more lab work to do. Lab work is the messy arts and crafts side of dentistry that you do between seeing patients. Like if you take an impression using alginate, you'd have to whip up some stone and pour it into the impression. Then you can separate the cast, trim the impression, then do some sort of work on the cast. Lab work is terrifying. One wrong move and you can ruin hours of work and be forced to start over. Often classes would have you do lab work between classes, which often meant you had to stay late after class or come in on the weekend. Aside from SimLab, you still have plenty of classes just like last year. The subjects this time are a little bit more focused on dentistry, things like oral pathology, pharmacology, and TMJ. Lastly, your clinic experience gets a little bit more interesting. During your first year in the SimLab, you learn the basics of doing dental cleanings. Now you get the chance to practice on real patients. The school very carefully selects easy patients that lets second year students clean their teeth. Over the course of the whole semester, you'll be assigned roughly 5 or 6 patients to clean. This was a nearly overwhelmingly stressful thing to get thrust into. Sure, I know how to do a cleaning, but where do I get the materials to do it? How do I set up a cubicle? How do I use the medical records system? What if they need x-rays? This is one of those things where you just had to dive in, not knowing all the details, and pray you make it out alive. The first few times you do it are a disaster. Sure, the cleaning gets done, but they hardly teach you all the clerical stuff in between. The craziest part is, while you're working, the upperclassmen are right next to you doing what you're doing, but faster, smoother, and more confidently. Plus, they're tackling procedures you've only practiced on a mannequin. You look at them and realize, that's going to be me in 1 year? How the hell am I going to do that? In summary, I rate year 2 as a 2 out of 10 in terms of overall enjoyment and a high 9 out of 10 in terms of stress. SimLab and lectures pound you relentlessly, and I feel like I was constantly treading over water, trying to make sense of lectures and the clinic. Almost everyone I talked to agreed that the second year of dental school is the hardest by a pretty healthy margin. My day-to-day was mostly the same, since classes started at 8 a.m. and a sim lab would be let out about 4:30 p.m. The only difference was that on most weekends I'd have to go in to do lab work for about 4 or 5 hours a week, which sucked, but it had to be done. Year 3, pack up your things and move out of the sim lab because you're never going to see it again. Your first 2 years you were learning how to do things on paper, and now it's time to dive into the clinic head first. Even classwork is reduced to a few hours a week. Your objective for the next 2 years is one thing: complete your requirements, which consist of doing a certain number of fillings, crowns, dentures, and deep cleanings, along with a myriad of other patient-based competencies. But one step at a time. At first, I was assigned a handful of patients, but what was strange was there was no longer somebody holding my hand. It was up to me to contact my patient and set up my appointments. Suddenly, there was nobody telling me where I had to be. The first week of school in the clinic, I could have chose to just sit at home and watch Netflix and nobody was going to stop me. If I wanted to graduate, it was on my shoulders from here on out. I seriously wasn't expecting this kind of autonomy in school. For your first few months in your third year, nobody really expects your schedule to be booked with patients, and a general rule was to try to see all of your patients for an exam and a cleaning in the first 2 or 3 months of the summer. If you did any fillings or anything working towards your requirements, that was a nice bonus. Again, it was a massive learning curve to get the hang of how the clinics worked, but thankfully the upperclassmen were incredible. I remember on multiple occasions, some of them individually spending hours of their own time to help teach us third years how to do things. At times I looked at them and I thought, how am I going to be like them in just 1 year? I just couldn't fathom it. But slowly, I started seeing patients for simple things like exams and cleanings. Even though I made almost every clerical error you possibly could, I began to slowly learn the ropes about how to manage the non-dentistry things. Despite me trying to move slowly with my patients, one of them needed a filling quickly, and I had no choice but to man up and do my first filling on a live person. To say I was terrified would be a gross understatement. The filling my patient needed was the kind that I had the most practice with, but it was really deep and close to the nerve of the tooth. If I cut the tooth even a single millimeter too deep and exposed the nerve of the tooth, I've almost guaranteed my 15-year-old patient would need a root canal and a crown, which would turn into a financial burden on an already struggling family. I will never forget the day I sat down with that high-speed handpiece, preparing to do the filling. It was time to perform, and I did, with perfection. I mean it when I say it's almost impossible to describe the feeling of being completely prepared for a situation, but still being so mentally terrified. Like my body was trained for the work, but my brain was on fire. It was a stressful day, but I made it out alive with a great outcome for the patient. Over the next few months, I started seeing more and more patients for fillings. The nervousness for doing the fillings was always there, but it went down drastically after I had done a handful of them. The days melted into months, and suddenly I was at the end of my third year. I had acquired about 30 patients who I was seeing in a rotating fashion. According to my dashboard, which is a summary of your progress toward graduating, I had done lots of work. These 3 numbers are the total number of points you get for doing a procedure. An exam is 6, a filling is about 10, and a harder procedure procedure like a crown is 40 points, and your goal is to be higher than the number on the left. For the most part, I was on track for points, but I quite literally did not do a single difficult procedure toward graduating. Like here you can see dentures and crowns. This number is how many I need, and this is how many I have. A big fat 0. Actually, no, I have 1 root canal. Yay me. So how did this happen? What was I doing wrong? Well, the answer was I wasn't prioritizing seeing patients who needed important work. I saw everyone equally, which meant nobody's treatment moved forward very quickly, meaning lots of my patients fell off after the first few months before getting to the important work. They still needed the work, but at that point their toothache was gone, their cavities are filled, and a crown can seem like an unnecessary expense, even though it's best for the health of the tooth. I realized I needed to prioritize individual patients and work quickly through their treatment, and I left all that work for my last year of dental school. Before we move on, third year gets a 6 out of 10 in terms of enjoyment, and a modest 4 out of 10 in terms of stress. There's a pretty big learning curve to starting in the real clinics, and it takes a number of appointments to get the grasp of the workflow, but after that, things get pretty routine. The hardest part was being the master of your own schedule. I never thought I would have full control of when I had to be at school, so prepare yourself for that. As far as my day-to-day schedule, appointments in the clinic start at 9 a.m. and go for 3 hours until 12 p.m. Then again from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. I always go to school an hour early to set up, so I was still getting up at 7 a.m. and leaving at 4 p.m. Occasionally I'd have to spend a few nights studying for the tests for the few classes I had, but other than that, most afternoons and weekends I didn't have to think about school at all. Year 4. The race for graduation really starts now. You have 0 classes, there's still no sim lab, it's truly you versus your requirements. And in my case, I had almost 80% of my requirements to do in just 1 year. I'm going to break it down to the last 3 semesters, D4 summer, fall, and spring. D4 summer. No more messing around. I've dreaded tackling these procedures, but time is running out. I asked my supervisor if I can get more patients dumped on me. I needed a fresh set of patients to work through. Unfortunately, a fresh set means I have to go through all their exams, cleanings, and fillings before I can get to the good procedures. So in just a few months, I nearly doubled my number of exams and cleanings, and I had done my first 2 crowns. By the end of D4 summer, I was set up pretty well with patients ready to get their work done. Before I move into D4 fall, during this summer was when we took a written boards exam, the INDBE. I don't have too much to say about it other than I used boot camp again to prepare for it, and it was remarkably easier than the DAT, mostly because it's primarily dentistry related, which is what you've been learning for the last 3 years. Dental school prepares you really well, and if I'm not mistaken, everyone in both my class and the class before me passed their test on their first try, myself obviously included. During this time there was also a patient-based boards exam, which was moved to mannequins since the Rona, but since I was planning on staying in the same state where I attended school, I was able to be exempt from taking it, so basically, it was about the same as a competency back in SimLab, which now you'll be absurdly prepared for, but it's still a big ordeal and I'm grateful I didn't have to do it. D4 fall. To say I hit the gas would be a massive understatement. From September of 2023 to December of 2023, I did 4 crowns, 2 root canals, 1 denture, and was almost done with 2 other dentures. Plus I was finishing up the easier requirements and tackling some competencies. Now, I don't know how this sounds to an outsider, but for dental school, this was a lot of work. I won't go into details about it, but everything at the school moves at a snail's pace. So this was a pretty big accomplishment, and most importantly, something drastically changed in my day-to-day life at school. I had completed around 250 appointments, and with that, I finally had a really good grasp on how the clinics functioned. I understood the flow of appointments. I knew how to jump through the hoops, and dental procedures were becoming easier. It took a ton of repetition, but I was the cool and confident upperclassman that I thought I would never be. And with the class below me just starting clinic as well, I felt an overwhelming desire to help them in any way I possibly could. I didn't want anyone to feel as lost as I did. I also realized that the same mindset applied to the doctors who worked with the students in the clinics. All of them were extremely passionate and cared very deeply for their students, and even more importantly, for our patients. This semester was a tipping point where I felt like a real professional. D4 spring semester. For my last semester, I simultaneously did the most amount of work and the least amount of work. I completed 5 of my dentures, did 6 more crowns, and finished off my last competencies. But as far as actual dentistry, I was only seeing 5 or 6 patients that I needed to graduate, while my other 60 patients were slowly passed down to other 4th years who needed them, or to 3rd year students who needed more patients. Unfortunately, this meant I had an obscene amount of paperwork to do in order to clear out my patients to prepare myself to graduate on time. But it wasn't stressful, just time consuming. Then, with just 2 weeks to spare, I delivered my last denture and I graduated on time, getting my diploma on May 18th, 2024. For the 4th year of dental school, overall enjoyment was at an all-time high of 9 out of 10, but it was a little bit more stressful than 3rd year with all of your requirements looming over you. 5 out of 10 for stress. With all of dental school behind me, I look back and I ask the same questions I did before I started. Did I slip between the cracks? Was I an average Joe who infiltrated the school? Did my classmates and I get brainwashed into becoming professionals and everyone else got kicked out of school? The answer was no to every question. I learned that the doctors and professionals I looked up to were average Joes just like me, just with more experience under their belts. We're all on the same path of 1,000 steps. Some of us are just further along, and all we have to do to match them is just keep on walking and don't step off. 107 of my classmates stepped into Marquette Dental School in 2020, and all 107 of us stepped out in 2024. The same goober who was watching tennis in the front row of our lectures in our first year was one of the star students who had their requirements finished almost half of a year early. And the people who were excited for Jujutsu Kaisen, playing RuneScape or Dungeons & Dragons, they all got their diplomas as the same goofballs I met 4 years earlier. If you're interested in pursuing dentistry or healthcare in general, you need the resilience to keep moving forward, and just know that you'll morph into the person you aspire to become. And most importantly of all, you have to love your patients. That was the most common thing I saw in every classmate and doctor I've ever met. Everything is done in the best interest of the patient. If anyone thinks that dental school is where you go to learn how to exploit your patients or become servants of the government to keep people oppressed, you're so incredibly wrong. Please take my word for it. If you meet an evil dentist, they didn't learn it from Marquette. Even if you don't end up going into dental school or into healthcare, you need to know that you are absolutely as worthy as the person you wish you were. Just like how I looked up to the other doctors with a false preconception of them, the idol you look up to is not better or more gifted than you, nor are they some outlandish version of you. You'll reach your goal and realize that you're the same person you always were. The only difference is that you stuck through it and you walked a long and hard path. The only way you can truly fail is to stop trying, so keep walking. Don't look forward to how much further you have to go. Be proud of how far you've already come. Thanks for joining me on this video, and I'll be rooting for you.